Great. Okay. So we're going to start off with a question about how, as DePIN projects mature, how do we ensure that physical infrastructure remains resilient and adaptable given how quickly changing innovation is in the digital space? Start with you, Abhay.
Sure, I'll start. So since Helium's been around for, I guess, the longest in this group, we've definitely seen supply side change over time, and it usually is really the way that I think about it is that you're kind of the way that the deployers are incentivized to deploy needs to sort of be somewhat flexible, and it has to be very specific to what you're deploying. For IoT, we have a model that allows you to get rewarded if there isn't a lot of coverage around. And once there is a lot of redundant coverage, folks in that area may not be rewarded as much. And that changes over time, right? Like hotspots will be RMA'd, hotspots will sort of run out of connectivity, or there might be a power outage or things like that. And, your network just has to be somewhat flexible to those things. This is actually why I often am very against a UBI for hotspot deployers. I think like if you just if the assumption that a deployer has that they'll always get paid for doing no work, that kind of gets away from this idea of a proof of physical work, which is kind of what we do in DePINs. So I think that it's important that deployers are, at least on the supply side, are incentivized for doing the work that they're actually doing. Otherwise, what's really the point?
Yeah, and I can kind of go from that as well too. Totally agreed with what he said. I'd say, and what we're building at Dawn is, similar in terms of it's a protocol for providing decentralized broadband. And one of the kind of things when we designed our original system is we knew that broadband technologies are going to be changing throughout the years. Like it doesn't matter whether it was fiber, now we're kind of going towards something more wireless based. And I think having mechanisms by which capital formation can kind of help steer emissions to the technologies that the community believes will generate the most value from, in our case, to provide broadband. I think those types of mechanisms are an important one because we have to have like a mechanism that says, okay, today we're going to be deploying 6 gigahertz to provide gigabit level service. Tomorrow maybe it's 7 or whatever that is. And so having a way for those types of transitions points to be capitalized by other members of the community and help steer emissions that way is kind of how we think about the hardware upgrade cycle. And I think, it's kind of depends on what type of sector you're in as well. Like telecom kind of has like a sinusoidal investment schedule, but other, verticals don't necessarily have that. So I think kind of looking at tokenomics from that perspective of how do you help ease those transitions with emissions in the right way is kind of the little bit of an art rather than a science there.
And one thing I might add, from my experience of running one of the biggest Wi-Fi manufacturers, Linksys, before coming into DePIN, is that the pace of change in Wi-Fi in particular technology is rapid. So it seems like it went from Wi-Fi 5 to Wi-Fi 7 in a blink, and it will never stop going quicker and quicker. So one of the ways that at least we're trying to avoid almost immediate obsolescence is by over-speccing the hardware that we're deploying and making it incredibly modular. 375 collect data, and we built a system that means it can be upgraded over time. And our hope is that the way that we spec the box, and designed and built the custom hardware, means that it has some longevity. And I think the other way, if I might add, to kind of counter very, very quickly things becoming obsolete is by having a kind of BYO hardware option. So being able to support stuff that's already in the wild or being manufactured and being able to connect and contribute to your network, I think is a good way for there to be less wastage when it comes to hardware that's going to have a shelf life of a year.
Yeah, I might come I could speak out loud too. Okay. Yeah, so I come at it from a little bit of a different perspective. When I think of resiliency of a DePIN, I think of it from the perspective of how does the DePIN evolve to essentially make it so that it works in perpetuity, right? So when a lot of these projects that we interact with, specifically in the IoT-specific DePIN space, they're using off-the-shelf components to build their devices today. And so when they think about how do we ensure the effectively operation of our DePIN for the foreseeable future, one of the things specifically that they think about is how do we prevent gamification, especially as incentives become more of a driver for usage of the network, especially from the supply side. So kind of an example I like to point to is one of the projects that's using Kwil is in kind of the creating renewable energy credits based on the amount of solar energy being generated by solar panels. And this technology is precedented, like this already exists, but they're actively thinking about how do we evolve our DePIN to prevent gamification. So like, for example, a solar panel has incentive to say that, a solar panel operator, has incentive to say that their device is producing a lot of photovoltaic energy. But how do we like put checks against that to say that, okay, maybe it was a cloudy day. You obviously didn't have like solar all day long. So connecting, for example, we have using event-driven oracles to integrate data from external sources to say, okay, within a reasonable doubt, your data is correct. So there are ways in which you could evolve your network, not necessarily only from like the hardware evolution, but also how do you actually evolve your DePIN so that you can make it so that the way it operates is able to keep up with potentially gamification of the network over time. So that's kind of how I think of resiliency.
Great. I think a lot of different perspectives, not just the physical, but also the network aspects. Going back to usage, what do you think are the most effective consensus mechanisms for managing all the DePIN networks, especially when you have to consider things like latency and bandwidth constraints of the physical infrastructure?
Yeah, I can take that one. I mean, on our side, when we need to, we're building essentially like a decentralized broadband marketplace using wireless technologies. And for us, we looked at, as Solana is really providing our data consensus layer, but then we know we needed to build a custom network consensus layer that sits on top of that. And that includes being able to provide a decentralized measure of certain things like latency, throughput, frequency, location, and all that sort of stuff. And I think that's kind of, we were coming up with the tip of what modern DePINs are doing, and they don't really have a bulletproof solution for it. So on our end, one of the partners we teamed up with is this group called Witness Chain that provides essentially various proofs that can help us with this different approach. So I'd say, we're going to see a lot of solutions like that kind of provide various proofs for the physical resources that are there. And it's, difficult other than to say that every kind of use case is a little bit different, right? In our scenario, we need to provide a decentralized measure of what the frequency is being utilized in a given area, but not a lot of other DePIN projects will have that. So I think that's kind of the first area that a lot of protocols need to focus on to be able to say, hey, this is actually a properly decentralizable DePIN, and this is why we can actually provide this in a trustless way.
It's kind of related, but not exactly a consensus. But I think the reward mechanics and how, the quicker a DePIN can get to a reward system that is based on the actual utilization of the asset, the better. So, in the case of Helium, data credits is based on the number of gigabytes of offload or usage of Helium mobile users coming through Helium devices. So I think that the stronger the correlation between actual real world money going into the foundation to drive buy and burn means that really it sorts the wheat from the chaff, and it takes away all of the gamification that has happened many times in early DePIN projects, and one of the reasons why our first 50 nodes, which I say is that these are $30,000 pieces of kit, we've sold well over $1 million of them. We're choosing where we put them, not the person who bought them, to avoid to one, maintain a network quality, but two, to avoid some of the pitfalls that have happened in early DePIN projects of people, throwing 100 Helium IoT gateways in their grandma's attic, or driving around with a Starlink on a flatbed truck and shooting stuff all over the place and capturing hexes or whatever it might be. If someone can think of it, they'll do it. And therefore, the quicker you can get to a mechanism whereby the reward is based on the actual utility, the better.
I totally agree. Like there's no question. I mean, there's just so much when you build an incentive system that is intended to be a bootstrap mechanism, the faster you can get away from the bootstrap, the better. Like you're absolutely right. And we've certainly seen it. And there's no shortage of that history. I think one thing that we're seeing with our mobile network is even though some of these devices are fairly expensive, it's still interesting to deploy these things in places where there's an incentive to do so, right? You're still going to do that. And we are for sure seeing the value of moving even faster towards like a data only incentive model on mobile than we've ever seen, even on the IoT side, because there's actual demand. Like, of course, it makes sense to deploy a hotspot, I guess here it'd be like Fulton Square or something like that, like right outside, right? There are so many people walking around. Like the goal of cellular is to, especially for high bandwidth cellular, is put it in places where there are a lot of slow moving people. That's where the hotspot should be, not in my office. Like it's useless. It's just a good test, but not really useful for coverage, right? So the more that we get there, I think the better. The other thing that's that Neil sort of mentioned that I think makes a lot of sense. Not everything needs to be on chain. The economic utility is sort of the economic data, economic state, like that stuff ends up on chain, but it really is derived from a lot of input. I mean, I think right now Helium processes about 0.5 terabyte a day of IoT and mobile like activity data to generate what is roughly a Merkle proof on Solana. Like that's really what it is. It's a claim token, and so that if you think about that, like you build massive data pipelines for these things, but really to just say, okay, this one hotspot owner gets 100 IoT and this other hotspot owner gets 1,000 mobile, like that's what the end user really ultimately cares about. They don't necessarily care about how decentralized that data pipeline was. They do care that it's auditable. They do care that it's transparent. But ultimately, like, maybe it's just as simple as an S3 bucket and fraud proofs. Like that's maybe all you really need for some of this data.
Yeah, we can move on. I don't know if I have, you guys have covered the topic maybe. I mean, tend to synthesize, and I do agree. I think business need definitely should drive what you do, specifically with like the consensus mechanism, right? It boils down to incentives and listen to your customers. They will tell you what to choose.
Okay. So I think Harry was talking about these $30,000 pieces of machinery, right? That you are choosing, excuse me, where to put. So I think the question that I have is around balancing decentralization with the practicality of maintaining, upgrading. Talking about the physical infrastructure that we had to deal with earlier.
Yeah. So. As I say, the reason why we've decided to do that initially is to maintain network quality and also to build a network which immediately has utility. So our business is in the business of capturing real-time intelligence. And if you just had these boxes randomly placed across America, you really don't have any meaningful scale in any one geography. So we're deploying initially in 3 major metros: Los Angeles, Miami, New York. So there's a concentration of data. We've also done a 10-year exclusive partnership with one of the biggest billboard REITs in North America, Outfront Media, who have 400,000 signs, posters, screens across the country, many of which are on some of the busiest highways in the world. So these devices we can strategically place on feeders that come, arteries that come in and out of cities, to mean that even with 50 devices, we will understand the movement of millions of people, millions of cars on day one, and then grow from there. What we're doing to then enable, I guess, the more consumer or retail customer to be involved is miniaturizing this kind of supernode into something that effectively does the same thing, similar sensing capabilities, but instead of having $6,000+ cameras. It's got one camera, and it doesn't have a $8,000 NVIDIA GPU. It has a Qualcomm GPU, and it can be bought for less than $1,000, placed in front of your home, placed in front of your business, give you analytics on how many people are walking past, what breed of the dog is, does someone have a cup of coffee in their hand, what's the car? And for businesses, that could create genuine utility, as well as give them a security camera. Plus, they're rewarded for when we monetize that data. And as I say, the reason for having managed deployment, the devices have been sold in a very decentralized manner to DePIN enthusiasts from mainland China, Netherlands, Taiwan, US, UK, all over the place. But it's kind of, I guess, managed deployment for the initial devices, and over time there'll be other form factors which people can, and also this BYO strategy. There's cameras in this room, there's cameras everywhere. There's no reason why, just like I have Ubiquity at home, and I could put Helium in my house just by putting a line of code into my Ubiquity system, and that's a hell of a lot better than going out and buying more and more and more things. And I think that's another kind of challenge that DePIN faces, is, and particularly with smaller IoT and smaller devices, is that if you want to be like a major deployer, you don't need like 10 Raspberry Pis sitting on your roof, because you could just have, one computer that's reasonably capable, and then have modular multimodal sensors that can do 20 different DePINs all in one go. So we're certainly looking at trying to enable, and we're working with Dawn and others to use our sites as places for other DePIN businesses, and we've deployed over $1 million of Helium a year over the years. So we've certainly kind of seen the good, the bad, the ugly of DePIN as it's. I mean, it wasn't even called DePIN; didn't even exist when we started. So, as a term, at least. So, so that's certainly the way that we're looking at it.
I mean, there's a lot of waste being generated, a lot of e-waste being generated by sort of our industry, I would say. You're absolutely right. You don't need 12 Raspberry Pis on your roof. That's nuts. When we moved, we needed the Raspberry Pi in our first Helium hotspot because they were running full consensus nodes. But when we switched to being a light client, there is so much latent compute now available on 370,000 or something active hotspots that are out there, IoT hotspots out there. And one of the things I've been thinking about over the last really year is, how do we put more interesting compute on there? Because it's such a waste. I totally agree with you.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of something I saw on Twitter, a debate kind of DePIN versus DVIN. I know alphabet salad, it's kind of frustrating, I'd say, but really the crux of it was, there's kind of the thesis of devices, but also using kind of spare devices that already exist. And the debate was I think was either or, but I more see it as kind of a spectrum. To your point, there is a time and a place for actually installing new devices, but we also have a lot of spare compute out there in our homes and in our buildings and everywhere we go. So yeah, it's really interesting to see, because kind of from the perspective of Kwil, the users we see today are more on the side of DePIN building IoT devices from scratch. But it's interesting to see, as obviously we're more connected, the devices we use are more connected, how to pretty much communicate to those people why it's valuable to you to become part of a DePIN, not only from the perspective of okay, you're part of this ecosystem, but tangibly, what does this provide to you monetarily, business-wise, etc. So I think that's something that I'm kind of more focusing on. I know I had a conversation with you back in April, and I think one of the value props of decentralization within the space is better alignment of consumers to actual supply side, right? Better alignments of these markets. And I think that removing middlemen, essentially making the actual governance mechanisms around how a DePIN works more transparent, are ways to gather early adoption. But I think as DePINs grow, the actual monetary reward, how you actually engage with this for a benefit, as we define that more and more over time, I think adoption will grow. So yeah.
Speaking of adoption, I think one of the really exciting things is we're not trying to invent something new. We're using we're leveraging what already exists, right? There's a lot of physical infrastructure that needs to be moved on chain. So how do you guys think about scalability, more from the user side than the actual infrastructure side?
Yeah, I guess from the projects I've spoken to as well, like just for some context, we are not in and of itself DePIN. Some of the projects building using Kwil are like IoT specific DePINs. And for the most part, their main concern is in finding product market fit. So the reason I mention that in the context of scalability, once they find the customer need for why decentralization, it becomes a lot clearer how to use decentralized infrastructure and then backfill that to be more scalable, right? So not, like you said, not everything needs to be decentralized, but really you need to determine what part of your stack your customers care about to think about essentially what parts of your DePIN need to be decentralized. So yeah, that's kind of like what I'm thinking about from like the scalability concern, because ultimately, like for example, a solution like Kwil, you could decide what you can and can't prune. Like my take is a lot of the value in DePIN generated data relates to like what is current, right? So like if you think about it from the context of the example I gave earlier, like in the renewable energy credit protocol, right? If you're doing line of predictive markets related to solar generation, right? What matters to you is the validity of up-to-date data. Whereas like historical data, you could cross-reference with other sources to get a pretty good idea of what is true. So like when I think of scalability, that's kind of like a cop-out anyway. But to be honest, it's more thinking about, okay, what tangibly do your customers benefit from decentralization? And then from that, think about, okay, how do we build your network to become scalable and really focus on what decentralization provides to your customers?
And I would say, I mean, what consumers are looking for, I guess, fall into three categories. One, utility, i.e. it does something that's useful to them. So whether that's a dash cam that they then, then they don't have to buy a dash cam because now they've got one. Or it's economics, i.e. they can make coins and it be profitable. But ideally, it's the intersection of both, whereby it provides them with some utility that they otherwise wouldn't have, and they would probably pay for anyway. And it's turning that utility into something that would otherwise be a cost and now is a profit center. But again, going back to my point around, these can't just be flash in the pan. You don't want to spend $400. You make your $400 back, and then you make a cent a year for the rest of your life. That's not sustainable. So hence why I think DePIN as an ecosystem is evolving to being more demand focused. So there is utility and usage of the networks for real world use cases from the get go. Now with some networks, it requires huge scale before that can happen, and it's like build it and hope for the best. And Helium have been, Helium Mobile is now like got real use case, real utilization. IoT has got a huge network with, incredible capability, but not actual monetization. So the 5G and Helium Mobile is like is a totally game changer. I can only assume I can't speak for you, but I can only assume is a pretty exciting time.
I mean, I would say that scalability is ultimately a UX problem, not a technical problem. Like it's, it's easy to go build yet another L2 or yet another bridge to another ecosystem or yet another whatever. But like ultimately your users don't care about that. Like they want to know that they can use the product. They want to know that it's like, they don't have to think about like what version of USDC I'm on or what version of like, bridge I have to go through or any of that nonsense. Like that's not going to help you scale. The thing that's going to help you scale is like make it really freaking easy to sign up for a phone plan or put a sensor on a network or, have access to like dash cam or camera data. I actually think you're absolutely right on the camera idea, which is like, yeah, I just want a security camera for my business. And if I can monetize that and give access to some of that data to some other authority that's buying that information, then not only does my business benefit, but so do the other businesses on my block, right? It's the same thing with broadband that Neil's working on. Like if I can bring internet, and I've had one of these, I've had a similar antenna on my roof for the last 10 years. I get a gigabit to my house, and another gigabit goes to about I think now 80 or 90 other houses in my neighborhood. And that's like scalability for me there is I get really good internet and so do my neighbors. The downside for my neighbors is that when I have a power outage, they have an issue. But with something like Dawn, like they could move their arm to another node like mine that actually provides them continuity while I suck and I figure out what's going on with my house.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think like scalability is largely a technical challenge. Like in our case, to what you said, like a lot of protocols will have like a cold start problem, or I think of it like a chicken egg problem. I think in our scenario, we are a little bit lucky at Dawn that we don't have that because it's all peer to peer, right? One person with excess bandwidth can sell that to somebody in their immediate vicinity. So you don't need some massive amount of emissions to create a whole bunch of supply to be able to leverage that. But then to Abhay's point, the extent to which it can be dead simple for users, I think is like number one, the most important thing for every DePIN project, right? Is you want to replace a real world Web 2 application with something Web 3. You have to make sure your on ramp and off ramp is like dead simple. And as we kind of look at like sources of inspiration, like we've had a lot of meetings internally where we're like, how does Helium take care of this from an on ramp and off ramp perspective, right? Like these guys have tried and tested it out, and that's where we've tried to learn from all of that. And then I'd say the kind of next piece towards scalability that I'll add to just comes down to transparency to the consumer in a lot of different ways. Like in our scenario, broadband is oftentimes oversubscribed, which is a normal thing, right? Like the FCC says on average, a household is at any given time is using about 1 megabit per second, right? But we're all here buying, gigabit level plans. So it's only a matter of fact that its things are going to be oversubscribed. But giving users insight into that level of oversubscription, like that's not something that you get from Verizon or Comcast today. They're not going to tell you how many people are sharing your gig, but being able to give users that insight into what it is and having them see what it is when they choose their plans, like you just need to remove the information asymmetry. And I think that's not only going to help make things easier from an adoption standpoint, it's going to, create some good level of trust, which is what you need to really scale on a user-based platform.
Okay, great. And then a quick round. Obviously, we have broadband, we have telcos. What are some other real-world systems that you wish would be built on DePIN?
Well, I saw some DePIN coffee capsule thing yesterday, so I've seen it all now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of along the lines of, what Abhay said as well, in terms of like this black box in the individual home that's going to provide a lot of different utility for every single DePIN project. So I'm really keen on kind of seeing how do you bring AWS into the household in a very interesting way. And that means kind of like solving a bunch of distributed compute challenges in a really cool way. So I'm excited by that.
I think a space that is unfortunately not super like a lot of technologies built in it is the waste management space. I think that like in walking around, I see a lot of the big belly solar, the ones with a solar panel on top of it. I don't know whether or not those are internet connected or anything like that, but I just think it's a space that could theoretically benefit from DePIN. I haven't thought too deeply into the rewards mechanisms behind it, but just generally speaking, I know traceability of garbage is something that is quite lacking. So I wonder if there's actual benefit to connecting whether or not it's like the more localized garbage cans or how those are being transported, and bringing that in some way to the DePIN space.
That's a good question. I think I think one thing that might be interesting would be around manufacturing. So I know that there's a project called 3DOS that's trying to build this with 3D printing, and trying to sort of distribute these 3D printers or have access to these distributed 3D printers all around the world, which I think is like really interesting for rapid prototyping. Like a lot of us build stuff in the hardware space. I think back to the time when I was in the lab, and like there was a huge unlock when you could, during the day figure out a like genetic sequence that you wanted to turn into either like a piece of RNA or a protein, and then you'd have to like plug it into the PCR, and then you had to wait a bunch of hours, and then you can actually start to do your experiments. There's this huge unlock around the time I was still studying that you could send a sequence to a company that would create that molecule for you and send it back to you the next day. That was enormous for science, for basic science research. So like essentially these were like PCR farms. I think there's an opportunity to do that in hardware. And there already is, you're already starting to see some of this with folks like 3DOS, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to do this in more than just these places. These machines are enormous. Building chips is really, really like fairly centralized today. There's especially the really, really like small, the sort of tiny factor chips. If you want to have something that's custom that you want to build and iterate on, it's actually fairly expensive and fairly slow. And to be able to just sort of very rapidly prototype some hardware and actually like see what it would really look like. Sometimes like physics you can model only up to a certain point, and at some point you just need to build the damn thing. And I think that's an opportunity where I think DePIN could be applied in a new way.
Great. Well, there's some business ideas for anyone who wants to go start a DePIN protocol. Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. That's all the time we have for today.
Thanks all.